It did not begin with a headline, nor with a leaked diary page or a late-night whisper on a tabloid hotline. It began with a woman who had lived her entire life, balancing between the blinding glare of fame and the quiet corners where her real secrets hid. Elizabeth Taylor had been many things to many people. To Hollywood, she was a gem carved from violet fire, the face that studios built empires around, the scandal that sold every newspaper they printed. But to those who truly watched her, who paid attention not to the roles she played, but to the pauses between them, she was a mystery, waiting for the right moment to open. For decades, she let the world believe that the great dramas of her life revolved around the men she married, divorced, or buried. 8 marriages, 7 husbands, endless speculation. Hollywood thought it knew her. But there was another Elizabeth, one who lived in the private shadows behind glamorous premieres and carefully staged interviews. She was a woman who loved intensely, instinctively, dangerously. And sometimes, that love did not look the way Hollywood demanded. The truth finally surfaced years after her greatest films had already become legend. It appeared first in passing comments from friends, then in memoirs from insiders, and later in a quiet admission she made when the world no longer controlled the narrative of her life. Elizabeth Taylor revealed that across different chapters of her turbulent journey, she had affairs with 6 women, women who saw her not as a star, but as a human being, aching for connection. They were not scandals. They were not experiments. They were emotional lifelines, forged in moments when fame felt like both a blessing and a cage. At the height of her power, Elizabeth was expected to embody perfection. The studios crafted every angle of her image, regulating who she could be seen with, what she could say, even how she should feel. They had no idea, or perhaps they refused to see, that longing and loneliness often pushed her into arms that did not fit the script they wrote. Behind closed doors, she found people who understood the intensity that frightened so many of her partners. Women who listened, women who stayed, women who saw the fragile girl behind the hurricane of beauty. Those 6 women entered her life at different times, through different doors. One was a co-star during a period of chaos. Another was a confidant who stepped in when her world collapsed after a loss she never fully recovered from. One arrived in the lonely aftermath of a marriage that drained her spirit, and others slipped into her life quietly, without the fireworks of a scandal, but with the soft inevitability of 2 souls recognizing each other. The world would never know their names in chronological order, nor every detail of what they shared. But fragments emerged, letters tucked into archives, anecdotes from staff who witnessed late-night conversations, small truths preserved by friends who had carried them for decades. These fragments revealed a woman who fought her entire life to be understood, not as Hollywood royalty, but as someone searching for peace in a world that rewarded her beauty but punished her vulnerability. When the confession finally became public, Hollywood reacted with a stunned silence more revealing than outrage. It was not merely that Elizabeth Taylor had loved 6 women. It was the realization that the industry built on glamorizing her life had never known her at all. The narrative they sold was incomplete, even dishonest. For the first time, the world saw how much she had endured, how much she had hidden, and how fiercely she had protected the pieces of herself she refused to let fame consume. Elizabeth Taylor had carried this truth through decades of scrutiny, not because she was ashamed of it, but because the world she reigned over was not yet ready for it. She lived in an era where one whisper could erase a career, where authenticity was a luxury no actress could afford. And so she guarded her heart the same way she guarded her diamonds, fiercely, carefully, and at great personal cost. As the story of the 6 women stepped from shadow into fact, a new version of Elizabeth emerged. Not the flawless beauty in magazine spreads, not the tempestuous lover of powerful men, but a woman who navigated the cruel machinery of fame while balancing desires she could not express. It was this hidden truth, not her scandals, not her marriages, not her legendary rose with Richard Burton, that became the key to understanding the real Elizabeth Taylor, a woman who loved bravely, secretly, and far more widely than the world ever imagined. Long before the confession ever reached the public, the duality in Elizabeth Taylor's life had already been quietly shaping her destiny. She was a woman trained from childhood to live inside a frame, to hit her marks, to smile when cameras clicked, and cry only when the script demanded it. Yet, the emotional landscape behind that carefully sculpted exterior was vast, unpredictable, and often unbearably lonely. Every film she made, every man she married, every scandal she survived was another chapter in a life that the world believed it understood. But the truth lived elsewhere, in moments that left no photographs, no headlines, only memories whispered between the people who truly knew her. She had been introduced to fame before she had a chance to understand herself. As a young girl on the set of National Velvet, she was told who she should be, what she should like, how she should behave. The purity of public perception became her prison. And inside that prison, she grew into a woman whose private needs rarely aligned with the expectations forced upon her. Her emotions were big, too big for the confines of the golden era's morality codes. She loved with intensity, and that intensity terrified people who preferred their stars predictable and submissive. With every marriage came hope, and with every divorce came a deeper wound, a sense that the version of love she longed for did not exist within the narrow lines society drew for her. It was during these moments of emotional turbulence that the first woman slipped into her life. The timing could not have been more delicate. Fresh out of a marriage that drained her spirit, Elizabeth found herself surrounded by people who wanted something from her, whether it was publicity, influence, or access to the living legend she had become. Yet in the midst of this chaos, there was a woman whose presence felt different. She offered no agenda, no judgment, no desire to mold Elizabeth into anyone's fantasy. Instead, she offered a listening ear, a steady presence, and a quiet understanding that pierced through the noise that defined Elizabeth's world. Their connection unfolded not as a scandal, but as a refuge, built slowly, privately, and without the pressure that came with her relationships with men. This pattern repeated through the years. Whenever Elizabeth found herself standing at a crossroads, emotionally exhausted, misunderstood, or crushed beneath the weight of public scrutiny, another woman appeared, not to replace a man, but to fill the emotional void that men in her life often could not. These women saw her in ways that went beyond beauty, beyond fame, beyond the sharp glamour for which she was praised. They saw her fragility, her fears, her longing for a love that anchored rather than consumed her, and in return, she offered them a tenderness and vulnerability she rarely showed in the harsh light of public life. It would be a mistake to assume these relationships were merely passionate diversions. For Elizabeth, each one reflected a specific crisis, a shift, a revelation. One woman entered her life during the storm of grief, following the loss of someone she loved deeply, becoming the only person capable of drawing her out of a darkness she feared would swallow her whole. Another came during the height of her fame, when she was surrounded by men who wanted to possess her but did not know how to cherish her. This woman gave her a sense of normalcy, a quiet space where the actress could dissolve and the person could breathe. As the decades passed, Each of these 6 women remained a secret. She protected not out of shame, but out of necessity. Hollywood had a long memory and an even sharper bite. For an actress to admit she loved women as well as men was unthinkable. The studios would never have allowed it, and the consequences would have been severe. Yet, Elizabeth held her truth close. Not as a burden, but as a private source of strength. A reminder that she was not defined by the men who dominated her public story. If these relationships had become public in their own time, they would have sparked a scandal that could have overshadowed her career. But many of the people closest to her have said that these women represented some of the most emotionally honest connections she ever experienced. This was the Elizabeth the world never saw, the woman who could drop her guard, who could speak without performing, who could love without the pressure of being a global symbol. It was in these hidden rooms of her heart that she found the kind of intimacy she searched for her entire life. By the time, the truth surfaced. The world had changed enough to hear it, but not enough to fully understand it. Yet understanding was never her goal. What she wanted most was to live authentically, even if authenticity came in fragments, in shadows, in whispered confessions protected for decades. The 6 women were not just lovers. They were chapters of a private life that strengthened her public legend without ever appearing in it. The stories of the 6 women who entered Elizabeth Taylor's life were never meant to be catalogued, dissected, or consumed by the public. They lived in the blind spots of fame, in the soft hours when makeup was washed off and the diamonds were placed back in velvet boxes. The world had been obsessed with her husbands, with the grand theatrics of her romances with men, particularly the combustible mythology she built with Richard Burton. But the women, each of them a secret constellation, were never part of the official script. They existed in coded glances, locked drawers, fragments of memories shared by those who walked closest to her but never dared speak until the world became safer. Each woman came from a different orbit. One was a celebrated actress whose friendship with Elizabeth was so close, the tabloids invented feuds to explain their intimacy. Another was a writer known for her sharp wit and the kind of emotional intelligence Elizabeth was starved for. One was a socialite who moved effortlessly through elite circles, serving as a mirror that reflected back the version of Elizabeth that wasn't a commodity, but a person aching for connection. Another was a costume designer, whose hands had shaped some of Elizabeth's most iconic on-screen looks, and whose quiet, patient presence became a form of emotional shelter. The 5th was a political activist whose fearlessness fascinated Elizabeth, offering her a glimpse of a world where a woman could live without apology. The final woman was someone almost no one knows, a private presence from outside the industry, and perhaps the one who understood her most deeply. What made these connections extraordinary was how each one answered a different question in Elizabeth's life. Fame had made her desirable, but it had also made her lonely. People wanted the icon, the legend, the wild beauty with violet eyes and a talent for breaking rules. But very few wanted the woman who cried in hotel rooms, who struggled with grief, who feared being unloved once the lights dimmed. These 6 women offered something the world around her rarely did: unfiltered emotional truth. To understand why these relationships mattered, one must understand the world she lived in. Hollywood, during Elizabeth Taylor's era, was a rigid machine. It controlled narratives down to the syllable. It erased identities that did not fit its narrow moral code. The studios would have never tolerated a leading actress whose private life challenged their manufactured ideals. For Elizabeth, the secrecy was not deception. It was survival. She carried the weight of her truth like a diamond hidden beneath layers of velvet precious, dangerous, and impossible to reveal without consequence. But even in secrecy, these relationships left imprints that shaped her public life in ways people never realized. There were unexplained shifts in her performances, sudden moments of rawness that critics praised as genius but never understood. There were abrupt retreats from the spotlight, moments when she disappeared into private spaces with no clear explanation beyond vague claims of exhaustion or illness. And there were changes in her style, her voice, her energy that coincided uncannily with the arrival or departure of these women. The public never connected these dots, but those closest to her later admitted the timing was far from accidental. One of the most telling accounts came from someone who worked inside her home for decades, a person who witnessed the quiet tenderness Elizabeth shared with a woman who remained unnamed in public conversation. According to this witness, the two seemed to communicate in a language of small gestures, a touch on the shoulder, a lingering glance, a kind of emotional synchronization that could not be explained away as friendship. The witness later said that Elizabeth seemed happiest during that period, not because she was defying expectation, but because she finally felt understood on a level fame had denied her. Hollywood, of course, had its suspicions. Internal memos from the studios suggested monitoring her public appearances, controlling her interview answers, and discouraging her from spending too much time with certain women in order to avoid misinterpretation. The desperation to preserve her image revealed just how fragile the industry believed its own creations were. And yet, Elizabeth continued living her truth in the only way she could, quietly, carefully, with the deliberate grace of someone who knew that authenticity did not need applause. These 6 women represented different eras of her life, different storms she survived, and different versions of herself she dared to explore. Some relationships were brief. Others lasted years in intermittent, undefined forms. Some ended in heartbreak, others in mutual respect, and at least one remained a lifelong connection, spoken aloud only in the safety of whispered conversations. The full truth, of course, remains incomplete, partly because Elizabeth protected it, and partly because those women, too, understood the cost of visibility in a world not ready for their story. By the time the world finally heard fragments of the truth, it became clear that this hidden chapter was not merely gossip. It was the missing lens through which Elizabeth Taylor's life finally came into focus. She had loved men fiercely, but she had also loved women tenderly. And together, these truths painted a fuller portrait of a woman who spent her entire life navigating desire, expectation, and the impossibility of fitting into one single definition. The deeper one steps into the untold corridors of Elizabeth Taylor's life. The clearer it becomes that her relationships with the 6 women were never simply hidden romances. They were emotional sanctuaries carved out of a world that left her exhausted, misunderstood, and relentlessly consumed by expectation. But those sanctuaries came at a cost. The most powerful woman in Hollywood was also one of its most vulnerable, because secrecy, even when chosen, extracts a price from the soul. And for Elizabeth Taylor, the weight of protecting her truth became heavier with each passing decade. By the middle of her career, she had learned how to perform not only on screen, but in life. Every time she walked into a room, she carried a version of herself that others expected. The glamorous star, the scandalous lover, the survivor with the violet eyes that seemed to tell a story even when she said nothing. This performance was not entirely false. It was simply incomplete. Beneath the layers of diamonds and designed perfection lay a woman who feared her real self could not safely exist in the unforgiving climate of mid-century Hollywood. She lived in a world where a single rumor could lead to cancelled contracts, moral condemnation, and brutal social exile. And yet the truth of her heart refused to be silenced. There were times when she came close to losing control of that secrecy. One of her closest female relationships took place during a period marked by intense public scrutiny. The press hounded her relentlessly, focusing on her marriages, her weight fluctuations, and her private struggles with illness. She found herself emotionally drained, oscillating between strength on camera and collapse behind closed doors. That was when a woman from the industry stepped quietly into her life, offering stability and emotional clarity she had never found in her high-profile relationships with men. They spent long evenings together discussing art, grief, and the kind of love that did not demand spectacle. Their bond deepened quickly, and soon staff members began to notice subtle changes, new softness in Elizabeth's voice, a different calm in her movements, a sense of being seen rather than performing. One evening, while attending a private event at the home of a powerful producer, the two women stayed close enough to draw lingering glances from those who paid attention. A rumor began to stir. Nothing concrete, just a flicker of suspicion carried by guests who whispered more than they listened. Elizabeth recognized the danger instantly. She had spent her life being watched, dissected, devoured by an industry that thrives on destroying the very stars it creates. A misinterpreted smile, or a hand lingering too long, could unleash a scandal that would not only cost her career, but devastate the woman she cared for. That night, she excused herself early, leaving the party abruptly, shaken by the realization that the world would rather punish her truth than allow her to live it quietly. This fear followed her for years. Every private conversation required strategic discretion. Letters were hidden. Meetings arranged through trusted intermediaries. The few people who knew fragments of the truth understood that speaking out would not just betray Elizabeth, it could destroy her. And yet, even with this constant threat hanging over her life, she continued to seek connection with women when her heart led her there. It was an act of courage disguised as secrecy. There was another moment, years later, that showed just how fragile the balance had become. While filming a major project, Elizabeth found herself deeply attached to a woman working behind the scenes. Their bond was immediate, rooted in mutual respect and an uncanny emotional alignment that made the actress feel for the first time that someone understood not only her strengths, but her vulnerabilities. They shared private breakfasts before the cast arrived, long walks after shooting, and quiet, intimate conversations that drifted far beyond the boundaries of friendship. One rainy afternoon, the two of them were alone on set, reviewing wardrobe changes. A photographer, typically trustworthy, wandered in early and captured a candid moment of Elizabeth, resting her head gently against the woman's shoulder. It was innocent in context, incredibly revealing without it. When Elizabeth saw the photograph, fear coursed through her. She knew how the tabloids operated. They would twist, exaggerate, invent, and weaponize such an image. She begged the photographer to destroy it. After a tense pause, he agreed. But the damage was not in the photograph itself. It was in what it revealed to Elizabeth about the fragility of her private world. A single shutter click could have erased everything she had fought to build. Her secret relationships were not only about desire, but also about healing. One woman entered her life at a time when she was reeling from the death of someone she adored. Grief had wrapped itself around her like a suffocating fog. She found little comfort in the men around her, who expected her to resume her public life before she had even begun to process the loss. But the woman who stepped in during those dark months understood grief in a way Elizabeth desperately needed. She visited without fanfare, She cooked for her. She held her when the nights felt too long. Their connection was profound, built on shared sorrow and the soothing presence of someone who expected nothing except honesty. That relationship did not last forever, but it carried Elizabeth through one of the most shattering chapters of her life. Living two lives took a toll on her health. She suffered from chronic pain, emotional fatigue, and a sense of isolation that even her closest friends could not fully penetrate. Sometimes she spoke in fragments, hinting at hidden truths she wished she could reveal. One confidant later recalled Elizabeth saying that love was the most complicated thing she had ever known, because the love she needed was not always the love she was allowed to have. These words carried the quiet ache of a woman who had lived more authentically than the world realized, yet never fully freely. Even as society changed and conversations around identity grew more open, Elizabeth stayed protective of the women who had shared pieces of her life. She understood that some of them still lived in the shadows, not because they lacked courage, but because they lived in realities where exposure would bring consequences. She shielded them with the same ferocity she used to protect her children from the hostile glare of fame. The secrecy, the fear, the careful dance between authenticity and survival, all of it shaped the woman Elizabeth became in her final decades. And while the world continued to define her through husbands, scandals, diamonds, and broken rules, the real Elizabeth Taylor lived in the quiet truth that only 6 women ever truly touched. By the team, Elizabeth Taylor entered the final decades of her life. The world believed it already understood the shape of her legacy. They saw the diamonds, the marriages, the legendary quarrels with Richard Burton, the humanitarian accolades, the scandals that kept tabloids alive for half a century. But the deeper truth, the one that softened her edges, sharpened her courage, and carved out the emotional depth she carried into her later years, was rooted in a private world the public never witnessed. The 6 women she loved, quietly and fervently, did not simply exist alongside her story. They rewrote it from within. Without them, Elizabeth Taylor would have still been a star. With them, she became a legend, made not of glamour, but of surviving herself. The first change was emotional clarity. Elizabeth had spent her early life performing emotions that were written for her, sculpted by directors and controlled by studios. Her relationships with men often mirrored those performances, dramatic, explosive, and heavy with expectation. With the women in her life, something different took place. She discovered how to express emotions without performing them. One confidant described how Elizabeth would sit for hours talking about her deepest fears, her insecurities about aging, her resentments toward the machinery of fame. These conversations, which she rarely dared to have with men, gave her a sense of emotional literacy she had long been denied. They allowed her to peel back layers she had built out of survival instinct, helping her understand herself as a woman rather than a symbol. This emotional depth later influenced her activism in ways most people never connected. When she fought publicly for people living with AIDS at a TMA, when Hollywood preferred silence, those close to her said she fought with the same fearlessness she showed in her private loves. She had spent years hiding a fundamental part of herself, and she knew the cost of shame. She recognized what it meant for people to be denied the right to exist fully in the light, and so she became their champion, with a fierceness that was fueled not only by compassion, but by experience. Her hidden history with the 6 women gave her an understanding of secrecy, dignity, and identity that shaped her activism in ways she never articulated publicly. Another transformation came in her understanding of intimacy. Elizabeth had always been a passionate lover, driven by instinct rather than calculation. Yet passion alone had never sustained her. The men in her life exhilarated her, but they also overwhelmed her, demanded from her, and often misunderstood the depth of her emotional needs. The women, however, gave her something she had long believed she could never have: peace. They offered attention without expectation, affection without control, and presence without performance. One of the six once told a friend that Elizabeth was never more herself than in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, barefoot, hair unbrushed, talking softly about a film or a memory she carried like a bruise. These moments were so ordinary they would have shocked the world that worshipped her for her extraordinary life. This sense of ordinary intimacy changed her acting. 2. The world noticed it before she did. As she matured, her performances became richer, quieter, and more devastating. Critics praised her ability to portray internal conflict with a single look, a shift in breath, a trembling pause. What they never knew was that Elizabeth had learned these nuances not in rehearsals, but in real life. The women she loved taught her how to listen without reacting, how to feel without exploding, how to hold emotion without letting it consume her. These were lessons that no acting coach could teach, because they were born of love, vulnerability, and emotional exposure. The impact of these relationships extended to her sense of self-worth as well. The world had always defined her through her beauty. Men desired her for it. Studios profited from it. Women admired and envied it. But for the first time in her life, the 6 women who stepped into her world did not relate to her through her appearance. They saw her pain, her humor, her intelligence, her contradictions. They validated parts of her identity that had nothing to do with her face or figure. This validation allowed her to age with a dignity that few stars of her era ever achieved. While others clung to youth with desperation, Elizabeth began to embrace her years as proof of survival. She no longer feared losing beauty, because the people who had loved her most deeply did not love her because of it. The most profound transformation, however, was her understanding of love itself. For decades, she had believed love was meant to be cinematic, loud, urgent, all-consuming. This belief had fueled her marriages, her heartbreaks, and her public persona. But the women in her life taught her a gentler version of love, one that was not about possession but presence, not about spectacle but sincerity. They taught her that love could be steady, nourishing, and deeply private. This shift allowed her to release the idea that love needed to be dramatic in order to be real. It was a lesson she carried into her later relationships, shaping how she loved her children, her friends, and even the men who came after. Perhaps the most unexpected impact was the way these hidden relationships reshaped her sense of legacy. Elizabeth Taylor understood, even in her later years, that history would remember her through the lens of her marriages, her jewels, and the fierce mythology that surrounded her. But the 6 women represented the version of herself that was never meant for history. They were the part she held back, the chapter she protected, the truth she only allowed to emerge when she felt the world might finally be ready. They helped her live without losing herself to the expectations of fame. They grounded her in reality, even as the world tried to turn her into an icon. And ironically, this private truth made her public legacy stronger. It humanized her. It deepened her. It added layers to the legend, layers the world sensed without being able to name. The vulnerability that the women nurtured in her became the foundation of her late life wisdom, her unexpected serenity, and her fearless advocacy. The 6 women were never footnotes. They were never curiosities. They were the quiet architects of the woman the world eventually came to admire. Without them, Elizabeth Taylor would still have been extraordinary. But with them, she became something rarer, a woman who survived fame without letting it steal her soul. As Elizabeth Taylor entered the final chapters of her life, she carried the weight of secrets that had shaped her, but that she could never fully climb in the public eye. These were not the kind of secrets that rot a person from within. They were the kind that define a life, that form the hidden architecture of one's identity. The kind whispered only in safe rooms, exchanged in the gentle quiet of someone's trust. The 6 women she loved had each shaped her in specific unforgettable ways. Yet as society evolved and conversations around identity broadened, Elizabeth remained fiercely protective of those women, of their privacy, to their lives, and the complicated realities they lived in. She understood that truth, once spoken too loudly, could become a weapon in the wrong hands. Even in her final decades, she still lived with the cautious instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched. She had become one of the most photographed women on the planet, yet she often remarked that being photographed made her feel strangely unseen. Cameras could capture her beauty, her charisma, and her iconic presence, but they could never capture the woman who existed behind those violet eyes. That woman, the real Elizabeth, lived in the shadows of guarded conversations, in handwritten letters, in nights spent confessing truths she never dared commit to film. In private moments with those she trusted, she sometimes referenced her past loves without naming them explicitly. A friend recalled her speaking wistfully of someone who understood me before I understood myself. Another remembered Elizabeth describing a relationship as the calmest storm I ever lived through. These were coded truths, glimpses of a private world she continued to protect, even when the public narrative no longer had the power to hurt her. Toward the end of her life, she began sorting through old boxes stored in closets and attics of her various homes. There were letters tied with ribbon, pages filled with looping handwriting, photographs that revealed a softer version of herself, one who smiled without posing. She spent long afternoons reading old notes, some written by her, some written to her, and others exchanged in moments when history was happening all around them. And yet, the world felt small enough for 2 people to exist in a universe of their own. She never revealed what she did with all of these artifacts. Some believe she destroyed the most revealing pieces. Others believe she left them in the care of someone who understood the importance of keeping the truth safe but accessible to future generations. If such a collection exists, it has never surfaced. There were moments in her later years when she hinted at regrets, but they were not regrets about the women themselves. She never regretted loving them. Her regret was that she lived in a world that forced her to fragment herself, to hide pieces of her identity, to love carefully when her nature was to love immensely. She once said in a private conversation reported by a close friend that she wished she had lived in an era where honesty did not feel like an act of rebellion. The statement held a quiet ache that only those who knew her intimately could understand. And yet, despite the secrecy, she never allowed fear to define her relationships. She remained loyal to those 6 women, even when circumstances or team pulled them apart. When one of them fell ill, Elizabeth visited discreetly, entering through back entrances, speaking in hushed tones, sitting beside her without the need for performance. Another woman faced a difficult divorce, and Elizabeth supported her financially and emotionally, ensuring her privacy remained intact. These acts of devotion were not widely known, but they were deeply characteristic of the woman who led with her heart, even when it broke her. The world saw her as fearless, but her courage came from surviving vulnerability, not denying it. She had weathered scandals, illnesses, losses, and the crushing scrutiny of fame. But perhaps the greatest burden she carried was having lived a love story she could not tell. Her relationships with the 6 women were woven into every stage of her life. Each one a reminder that love is rarely simple and never uniform. Each woman filled a different need, healed a different wound, illuminated a different truth. These relationships also shaped how she viewed her legacy. She spent her later years advocating fiercely for human rights, for compassion, for dignity. Her activism for people living with AIDS was not just an act of generosity, it was an act of defiance against a world that punished people for who they loved. She understood the cruelty of judgment because she had lived under its shadow. Her empathy was not theoretical. It was lived. It was earned. It was carved from decades of carrying truths she could not speak aloud. There were times when younger celebrities confided in her, seeking guidance about identity, love, and fear. Elizabeth never judged. She listened with the patience of someone who had been forced to silence her own truth. She encouraged them to live authentically, even if she herself could not always model that freedom. Her advice was shaped by the blunt knowledge that hiding oneself is like locking a part of the soul in a room with no windows. As she aged, friends noticed a shift in her. She became softer, more reflective, less guarded. Some believed she was preparing to share her truth in a memoir. Others believed she was simply tired of carrying silence. But in the end, she chose not to expose the women she had loved. She understood that their lives were intertwined with her own, and revealing their names or their histories would reshape not only her legacy, but theirs. The world wanted a confession. Elizabeth wanted dignity, for herself and for the women whose lives had been touched by hers. In the final years, as her health declined, she found solace in family, close friends, and memories she revisited quietly. Those who sat with her in her last days described a woman at peace, not because she had lived a life without pain, but because she had lived a life full of connection, passion, and truth. Even if much of that truth existed outside the reach of cameras and headlines, her reckoning, in the end, was not with the world. It was with herself. She had made peace with the fact that the public would never fully know her. She accepted that some stories are meant to be lived, not explained. The 6 women remained unnamed in her public narrative, but deeply etched into her private one. They were her confidantes, her healers, her mirrors, her secret history. They shaped her not through possession, but through presence. And though the world could not see it, they were among the most defining loves of her life. When Elizabeth Taylor finally left this world, she left behind more than jewels, more than films, more than the mythic reputation that had trailed her like a shimmering veil for nearly a century. What she truly left was a riddle, an unfinished story woven into the spaces between what the world saw and what she lived. Her violet eyes had carried secrets deeper than the roles she played. Secrets shaped by 6 women whose names she kept safe until her last breath. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that feels both complete and unfinished, luminous and shadowed, fully visible and yet forever partially hidden. Hollywood has always been hungry for crisp narratives heroes, villains, star-crossed lovers, and downfall arcs that fit neatly into headlines. But Elizabeth Taylor refused neatness. Her life was too large, too chaotic, too richly layered to be summed up by marriages, scandals, and box office triumphs. She lived intensely, loved recklessly, fought fiercely, and broke rules with a kind of grace that made her impossible to categorize. That is why the truth about the 6 women feels so integral to understanding her. It adds a dimension to her legacy that the public sensed without ever being able to articulate. It explains the emotional depth that radiated from her, the vulnerabilities she carried, the resilience she built her identity around. There is a reason people still speak of her not just as a star, but as a force of nature. People with lives as large as hers do not fully disappear. They leave echoes. Elizabeth's echoes live in her activism, her films, her cultural impact, and the parts of her story she entrusted to silence. One of the most intriguing aspects of her legacy is the intentional incompleteness of it. By never revealing the identities of the 6 women, she preserved something sacred. She allowed the world to speculate, but refused to give them the satisfaction of ownership. She kept those relationships intimate, protected, private not out of shame, but out of reverence. She knew that naming those women would shift the conversation away from love and toward scandal, away from humanity and toward spectacle. Her silence was an act of protection and defiance. But the silence also leaves questions. How deeply did these relationships influence her during her darkest years? How many decisions, public or private, were shaped by love? The world will never know. How different might her life have been if she had lived in an era where she could speak openly? Those who knew her best believed that the truth of her heart was far more complex than the public ever imagined. She loved men passionately, sometimes disastrously. She loved women quietly, sometimes fiercely. And in both kinds of love, she discovered different parts of herself. The men in her life gave her drama, fire, chaos, and the sense of being swept into a narrative bigger than herself. The women gave her stillness, clarity, safety, and emotional understanding. Each was essential. Each filled a different space within her. This duality is a key to her legacy. She was a woman who lived too intensely for one life, one narrative, one truth. The 6 women were not footnotes. They were secret chapters in a story that will continue to be studied, debated, and reinterpreted long after the last reel of Hollywood's golden age has faded. There is a tenderness in how she navigated her final decades. She did not rewrite her story to include the 6 women, nor did she erase them. Instead, she allowed the truth to exist in the periphery, like a constellation seen only through the corner of one's eye. The people who needed to know is new. The people who cared enough to ask received carefully measured answers, and the public was left with fragments enough to reveal the contours of a truth too powerful to remain buried, but never enough to betray the privacy she fought to preserve. Her courage in protecting those women also hints at another question. What might she have revealed if she had lived in a gentler time? Elizabeth Taylor witnessed the world shift dramatically. She lived long enough to see LGBTQ+ rights become a global conversation, to see younger stars speak openly about their identities, to see the stigma that defined her generation slowly begin to erode. Some close to her believed she considered opening up near the end, not to shock the world, but to humanize herself further. But she ultimately chose discretion. She never wanted her final chapter to be reduced to sensationalism, and so her story ends with one of the most powerful legacies in Hollywood history. A legacy shaped not only by the brilliance she displayed on screen, but by the love she protected off it. She transformed what it meant to be a star by living a life that refused to be flattened into a stereotype. She fought for those who were silenced because she knew silence intimately. She loved without apology, even if she could not always love without secrecy. And she forged a legacy that invites not certainty, but contemplation. Years after her passing, the world continues to ask the same questions. Who were those 6 women? How long did those relationships last? What did they mean to her? Did she immortalize them in photographs no one has seen? Did she write about them in letters still waiting to be discovered? These questions linger like incense soft, haunting, impossible to ignore. Perhaps the truth is that Elizabeth left the world exactly what she wanted to leave. A story with enough mystery to protect the people she loved, and enough honesty to reveal the fullness of who she was. For a woman who lived under the harshest spotlight imaginable, she managed to maintain a private universe untouched by the world's hunger for scandal. That alone is a feat few stars have ever achieved. Her legacy is not defined by the names she married, nor by the roles she played, nor even by the diamonds she adored. It is defined by her humanity, her contradictions, her courage, and the 6 unspoken truths she carried through, a life that demanded she be both goddess and ghost. Elizabeth Taylor remains an icon because she lived as both untenable. The world may never know the identities of the 6 women who shaped her heart, but the world will always feel their impact. Written in the way Elizabeth Taylor loved, fought, healed, and ultimately became a legend larger than the screen that made her.